Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Joe Fitzpatrick. I'm the Minister for Parliamentary Business. My Cabinet colleagues and I are delighted to be here in Fernhill for the fifth of our series of Cabinet meetings we're holding around Scotland to discuss our country's future. The referendum on the 18th of September is a choice between two futures. The First Minister and the entire Cabinet are committed to ensuring that the people of Scotland have all the information that they need to make their choice. That's why in the run-up to the referendum, the Cabinet is holding these sort of meetings right across Scotland to give you the chance to question the First Minister and the Cabinet on our proposals for an independent Scotland. But today the questions don't need to be just about independence. We're here to answer any questions you have about the work of the Scottish Government. As well as these Cabinet events, individual Cabinet Secretaries are also holding public question and answer sessions on Scotland's future, and to date we've already held around 25 events. New venues are being added to the events section of the Scottish Government's referendum site, referendum.com, and there are information in the packs on your seats. So if you have a look there, if you know anyone that hasn't managed to come along to one of the full Cabinet events, and point them in the direction of the website so they can go along to one of these town hall events. In a moment, you're going to have the opportunity to hear from the First Minister. Once the First Minister has spoken, we'll open up to take your questions for around about an hour. Following the formal session, I hope you're able to join us for a cup of tea and a biscuit in the Lesser Hall, where you'll be able to continue your discussions with individual Cabinet Ministers. So, without further ado, would you please welcome the First Minister of Scotland, Mr. Alex Salmond. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted, as is the rest of the Cabinet, to be here in Rutherglen. As far as I know, looking through history, this is the first time a Scottish Cabinet has met in Rutherglen, and we're delighted to be here at the Fernhill Community Centre. I should say that we've been on a tour of these Cabinet meetings. We've been to Bathgate in West Lothian, Portlethen in Aberdeenshire, Irvine in Ayrshire, Stornoway in the Western Isles, and we're going to Selkirk next month. And the purpose of all of these discussions, as Joe has been explaining, is not just to make the points that I want to make to audiences around Scotland, but also to give the audiences the opportunity to question each and any of these ministers who are here with us today. Now, of course, tactically, this is a very good idea, having the entire Cabinet assembled here, because when it comes to question time, if the questions are difficult, then obviously I'll delegate responsibility to any one of these able ministers, whereas if it's an easy question, then I'll step forward and take responsibility for myself. But each of these Cabinet ministers will be available to answer the questions. Now, one of the great things about taking the Cabinet around the country is that we're able to make some specific announcements that have particular effects in the area. And I want to just list three of the ones that the Cabinet's been discussing and we're making today. The first one, I should say, is not an announcement really for Rutherglen or Glasgow or even for Scotland. It's an announcement which actually has an impact in the entire world, because all of us will have seen on television the extraordinary fire which enveloped the Macintosh building in Glasgow, the Glasgow School of Art. And I say it's an announcement that affects all of the world because it has been voted one of the world's greatest buildings. It's just over 100 years old, and is an example of architecture and the genius of one of the greatest artists ever to come out of Scotland. It is a world significant building. But of course, it's more than a building, it's also an institution which educates and inspires many students. And so what I'm announcing today is that the Scottish Government this morning have agreed to match the Macintosh Fire Fund up to £5 million. And that means that all of the offers of help that have been coming in from around the planet, from the ex-students at the Glasgow School and the College of Arts contacts internationally, that will be matched pound for pound by the Scottish Government. Now, I should explain that that fire fund is not really about the rebuilding of the Macintosh building, which will happen. That will happen in terms of what comes from the insurance and what has to become from the funding council. This will be the immediate work to support the students, some of whom whose work has been badly affected or indeed destroyed. They put years of effort and will be making sure there is no detriment to any of the students who have been affected by the conflagration which has enveloped the Glasgow School of Art. We'll also be making sure that the immediate work of restoration is done. There will be many advantages. Not all of us will know here that Glasgow School of Art hosts the SciArt project, a company of Historic Scotland and Glasgow School of Art, which is the best digital technology in the world. This is a company which has mapped Mount Rushmore digitally in the United States, because their digital technology is better than what's available in the United States of America. They're part of the Scottish 10 project, which means, of course, that they have the ability and they have documented to a micromillimetre every possible aspect of that building, and therefore that building will be restored not just to its former glory, but to even greater glory. And that is absolutely committed to. And last thing I want to say about this is we shouldn't pass this subject without noting that I think in George Square I was told this morning that somebody has put a thank you to the Glasgow Fire Service, to the Scottish Fire Service, who have performed above and beyond the call of any duty and managed to save the majority of the fabric of the building and the majority of the great works of art contained within the building. So, ladies and gentlemen, here in Rutherglen, let's hear a round of applause for our fire service in Scotland. Now, two other quick announcements. Outside in the 4G pitch this morning, I was kicking the ball about at 8:30 this morning, and I was announcing a further £600,000 of funding for the street soccer programme, which, of course, one of the venues is outside there. The street soccer programme is really interesting. I mean, it's a project that helps about 800 people across Scotland each year, and basically it's designed for people who've come up against some of life's rough chances, and it's a means of using football to bring people back into society from whatever problem has beset them, whether it be drug abuse or whatever. And it's having spectacular success in engaging people back into society and setting them on to a better road. And the best thing about it is the funding, the £600,000 fund announced this morning, comes largely from the proceeds of crime. This is an initiative we set up some years ago by which the confiscated assets of criminals are set aside in a fund which is used to support things like the 4G pitch outside and initiatives like the street soccer programme. So you're taking money of bad folk and giving it to good projects. And there's a fantastic message there in terms of society. So I'm delighted to say we're announcing a further £600,000 worth of funding from proceeds of crime, from cashback for communities, to allow that street soccer programme not just to be fulfilled in Fernhill, but also across Scotland. And finally this afternoon, I'm going to something I'm really encouraged by, and that's the Aspire Church building in Farmalone Seat. It's used by Healthy and Happy Community Development Trust. It's an organisation which helps more than 6,000 people in Rutherglen and Cambuslang each year. It provides health information, advice to young people, encourages healthier eating, promotes active lifestyles. It will now be able to purchase the building, which will create a permanent base for that initiative and an asset for the community. And that is just one of the local projects today which will benefit from an additional £4.5 million that we're allocating today to the Clyde Gateway. The Clyde Gateway, as you know, will enable major improvements to the public spaces and travel routes, including King Street and Rutherglen Town Centre, better pedestrian routes along the Clyde, between Rutherglen Bridge and Dalmarnock Bridge. It will add to the work that's been done to bring enhanced improvements to Rutherglen and to Glasgow. And it will make sure, of course, that these communications, which are part of the investment for the Commonwealth Games, will have a long-term legacy effect on this community. So I'm looking forward enormously to visiting the Healthy and Happy Community Development Trust this afternoon and being able to make that announcement. And I should say that the Cabinet Secretaries will also be visiting local organisations this afternoon. Well, ladies and gentlemen, these are important local opportunities. But I want to say a word or two about the national opportunity that awaits us this coming September. And in doing so, I want to make 3 points. One, about why Scotland can be independent, why we should be independent, and above all, in my estimation, about why we must become an independent country. Let's take them in turn. Can Scotland be an independent country? Well, let me put a quote to you. Supporters of independence will always be able to cite examples of small, independent and thriving economies such as Finland, Switzerland and Norway. It would be wrong to suggest that Scotland could not be another such successful independent country. That sounds a very reasonable quote, ladies and gentlemen. It may surprise you to know that's a quote from David Cameron. Now, admittedly, he said it before he was Prime Minister. He's been saying a lot less sensible things since he's been Prime Minister. But nonetheless, it's an important quote because it's obviously evident common sense. He did forget to mention, of course, that in terms of wealth per head, Finland is 10% higher than the UK, Switzerland is 50% higher, and Norway is 85% higher. But nonetheless, it's a very reasonable point to make that around Europe there are examples of small independent countries which are successful, more successful than the UK is at the present moment. So if you get to a state, and I don't incidentally expect David Cameron to repeat that quote over the next 3 months or so, but nonetheless, he did say it, he did presumably mean it when he said it, and therefore it's something that I'll be quoting, because if you're in a position where even your leading opponent concede the essence of the argument, then I think we can safely conclude that Scotland can be an independent country. The ratings agency, Moody's, concluded all possible outcomes point to Scotland being among the wealthiest sovereign countries in the world. Standard & Poor, another rating agency, and these are people not known for their happy optimism about the economic prospects of any country or any company, concluded that even without oil wealth, Scotland is one of the most prosperous economies in the world. So, in any reasonable assessment, we can be an independent country. But what I want to go on to argue is why we should be an independent country. I think we should be an independent country because we've got to change the way and nature by which our economy has been governed and managed over the last generation. I want to talk about industrialisation, and in particular, I want to talk about de-industrialisation. You see, the UK, if you compare it with other countries, let's compare it with Germany, for example. 29% of the UK's economy back in 1970 was made up of manufacturing. By the time you got to 2011, it was just 11%. It's one of the steepest declines of any manufacturing country in the world. And deindustrialisation across the UK has made income inequality worse as skilled manufacturing jobs has declined. It's made the regional disparities in the United Kingdom much, much greater. Now, we've got a situation which has developed in the last few years since the advent of the Scottish Parliament, where Scottish unemployment is now lower than the UK average. Scottish employment, folk in work, is now higher than the UK average. And that's a good thing. And that, incidentally, in my estimation, is one of the great validations of having a Scottish Parliament. But if you look deeper into the statistics, you see a different picture. You see Scotland above the UK average, but you see one level of prosperity in London and the South East and a totally different level of prosperity everywhere else. So although we're better than the average, the UK has developed into two economies. A property, rentier economy in London soaring ahead, and a struggling economy in many, many areas of England, and Scotland better than average, but way, way behind London, and more importantly, way, way behind international comparators. If Scotland were independent tomorrow, we'd be the 14th most prosperous country on earth. So those who say we can't be independent are going to have to explain to us why there's about 180 countries in the world, certainly across the OECD, who are less prosperous potentially than Scotland. If Scotland can't be independent, then how could these people be independent? But being independent is more than about the physical aspects of being a national independent country. It's about what benefits for the people lie in that independence. And that is why I think the opportunity to re-industrialise Scotland is of huge significance. This community, Rutherglen, for generations was a major industrial centre. It had hugely important chemical industries, ropeworks, paper mills, engineering companies and other sites. And just as this community has suffered from deindustrialisation, so communities in many parts of Scotland have done exactly the same thing. That industrialisation makes inequality worse. And at the present moment, the Scottish Government can adopt some policies to mitigate that. But these are long-term trends and they need significant advances if we're going to do more. We can support, for example, the National Business District at Shawfield, plan for an industrial zone as part of the site. We can support the reindustrialisation of the Scottish coastline by concerted support for offshore renewable energy, which is being pioneered and advanced at Strathclyde University. These are important measures, but with independence we can do much, much more. What we want to see is a transformation of the economy and therefore a transformation of society. With independence, for example, we could establish a Scottish Innovation Agency. Finland, one of the countries that David Cameron mentioned, has established a special national funding agency for technology which works with universities, businesses and the public services. Finland now has the third highest level of spending on research and development in the developed world. Or we could set up a Scottish Development Bank based on banks, similar banks in Germany and Canada. And the idea of that would be to help small and medium-sized enterprises, which are absolutely critical if you have a thriving manufacturing base. The key point about being independent is that we could use every policy power available to us, targeted tax measures, promoting expert, linking skill to wider measures in the economy to reindustrialise Scotland and create a competitive and fair modern economy. And of course, we can make sure that work pays. You know, sometimes when the Tory party and Ian Duncan Smith, they talk about the Social Security budget, and they like to give the impression that this Social Security budget can be cut because we're going to identify all the scroungers and wasters in society and bear down heavily upon them. Of course, the reality is very different. Much of that Social Security budget supports pensioners, and much of the rest of it is supporting people who are in work. People who are in work but whose wages are such that they require additional support. So we can make work pay, guaranteeing that the minimum wage at least rises in line with inflation, unlike the last 5 years of Labour and Conservative government when the minimum wage didn't even keep pace with inflation. One of the proudest things that this government has done within the public sector in Scotland is we've introduced not the minimum wage but the living wage of £7.65 an hour, not a prince's ransom, but a significant enhancement across the public sector, across the health service and every government department to make sure that people are paid a fair wage for a fair day's work. We're leading a drive to get more women into the workforce. We're having a debate at the present moment. We're going to have a debate in the Scottish Parliament this week about this exact subject. I believe, we believe, this government believes, that by having nursery provision on the same level as primary education, we're going to enable far, far more women to get back into the workforce in Scotland. People say, how are you going to create the jobs for them? In the last 2 years, there's been 40,000 more women working in Scotland, most of them full-time. You create the childcare provision and then you get that big influx of women back into the workforce, supporting their families, supporting the economy, and making use of their skills and abilities to help the Scotland move forward. So a reindustrialisation of the country, a fairness in terms of attitude to work, an expansion of nursery education to provide that platform for women in society. These are the measures we need. These are the initiatives we need to take to make this new Scotland what we want to see it become. Ladies and gentlemen, I said the third thing would be about how Scotland must be independent. 5 months ago, just before Christmas, Rutherglen and Cambuslang Food Bank opened in Kirkwood Street. There are 2 other food banks within 3 miles of this hall in Parkhead and Govan Hill. In 2011, the Trussell Trust operated just 1 food bank in the whole of this country. Now they have 43. A few weeks ago, I attended the expansion of the food bank in Inverurie in my constituency in the northeast of Scotland. Now, the important point about this is, as I said, if Scotland was independent tomorrow, we'd become the 14th most prosperous country among the developed countries of the world. Inverurie is one of the most prosperous towns in the whole of Scotland. So we've actually got ourselves into a situation where a food bank is expanding in one of the most prosperous towns in the whole of Scotland, which could and should be the 14th most prosperous country in the developed world. What an extraordinary situation that has happened in Scotland over these last few years. So when we talk about Scotland must become independent, we're talking about why we must become independent so as we can close that gap of inequality in society, because equal countries are prosperous countries. I am 59 years old, ladies and gentlemen. I can see you all looking at me and saying, no, you don't look it. You are thinking that, aren't you? Right. For more than half of my life, more than half of my 59 years, Scotland at elections has voted in one direction, and we've ended up with a Tory government. For more than half of my life. And whatever happens, and things don't look good, incidentally, in terms of the political trends that are developing south of the border at the present moment, but whatever happens, you can absolutely guarantee that that pattern of that democratic deficit will continue if we continue with our current political arrangements. And if we allow that to continue, then the sort of statistics I've just quoted you about the growth of food banks, the extraordinary policies like the bedroom tax, imposed and enforced for no rational reason, are going to continue as well. And you might say, well, didn't the Scottish Parliament, didn't the Scottish Government do something about the bedroom tax? Yes, we did, and it cost us 50 million quid to try and mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax. We didn't abolish the bedroom tax because we don't have the political power, the legislative authority to abolish the bedroom tax, but we mitigated its effect. But why should we be spending our time in the Scottish Parliament in Scotland trying to undo the damage of policies that no one in this country voted for in the first place? That is the democratic deficit that Scotland suffers from. That is the consequence of, for more than 59, to half of my 59 years, that Scotland has voted in one direction and had a different government foisted upon us. And that is why we must not allow this to continue. We don't have the ability in Scotland to dictate the politics of the United Kingdom. We are 8.3% of the population. The chances of us affecting the balance of power at Westminster are very limited. It's only happened once over these, twice actually, over these last 50 years. Once in the election between 64 and 66, and again in the election between February and October of 1974. We don't have the ability to do that. But we have a different ability if we choose to take it this coming September. Sometimes people talk about sovereignty, national sovereignty. And it's worth thinking about what that actually means. What does sovereignty mean? Well, sovereignty doesn't mean that a country which is independent is not interdependent with other countries. No country is independent, complete of itself, separated from other countries. Scotland will not drift up to the North Pole when we become independent. We'll still have relationships with other countries, including our friends and colleagues south of the border, including other countries across Europe. We'll have these relationships. But independence does give the ability and carries with it the sovereignty of making a sovereign choice as to the direction of policies that you take economically and socially. And it does another thing, and September offers another opportunity as well. On that day, on the 18th of September, will be the day of sovereignty. It will be the day where people in Scotland, actually for the first time in history, because 300 years ago, incidentally, when the vote went in the opposite direction, they weren't asking people to vote. That was the very last thing that was happening 300 and more years ago. So on the 18th of September, people in Scotland will have their first democratic opportunity in our history to make that choice and make that decision. And on that day will be a day of ultimate sovereignty. From when the polls open to the polls close, every single one of us who live and work in this country will have the opportunity to make that decision collectively. Every single one of us will vote by post or will go into the polling station. And when we do so, will take the future of this country into our hands. That will be our moment of sovereignty. And when we do that, it's not going to be dictated by the television or the media, or by me, or by any politician, or by the parliaments, the Scottish Parliament, the Westminster Parliament. It's certainly not going to be dictated by the press. That will be a decision which will be made individually, collectively, severally, by all of us. And when that point comes on the 18th September, then I want people to think about the potential of this country. I want to think about the resource space of natural and human resources that we have, and why these things are really, really important. But above all, I want people to think about the sort of society that we can create. I don't think it will be a perfect country. No society, no country is perfect. But I think if we develop the ambition to make the country not just prosperous, but more equal, fairer, then we'll live up to our tradition as a country, and we'll set Scotland on a course that when we look back, having made that decision, which I hope is a yes, that every one of us will be proud of the direction that our country takes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, First Minister. We're now going to move on to the formal question and answer session. But first of all, I'll introduce everyone that's on the stage. The far side, we have Richard Lockhead, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs. Next to him, go on. Shona Robinson, Cabinet Secretary for Commonwealth Games, Sport, Equalities and Pensioners' Rights. And John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth. Then Nicola Sturgeon, a well-kent face and Deputy First Minister of Scotland. Mike Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education. Angela Constant, Cabinet Secretary for Training, Youth and Women's Employment. Alec Neil, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing. And finally, Kenny McCaskill, our Cabinet Secretary for Justice. So I'm going to take questions in batches of 3 and then invite the First Minister and other Cabinet members to respond. I've also got a number of questions that have been submitted through Twitter from people who couldn't be here today, and I'll try and feed them in as we go forward. Now, we normally have more questions than we have time to take, so please do get your hand up early and try and get your questions answered. But if we don't manage to come around to you, don't worry, there's forms on your chair. So if you don't get your question answered, if you write your question on the form, and there's boxes outside, if you put them into those boxes, then every question will be answered and you'll get a written reply. So let's start. If people could put their hands up, if you could say your name, and if you're here representing an organisation, then if you could also say that as well. So we'll start with the gentleman at the front here. I'll do 3 at a time. The gentleman in yellow, and the lady at the front over here.
Thank you very much. It's on. Excellent. Thank you very much. My name's Ian Scott. Churches have recently been demanding that in an independent Scotland they would have a uniquely privileged position in any written Scottish constitution. Can you confirm that they would not, that a Scottish independent Scotland would neither sideline religion, but also that they would not have this uniquely privileged position in our society?
So,
Mr. Salmon, the pound, this is one of the most important questions of all. You say they're bluffing. Why are they bluffing?
Okay, and lady here. Yeah, sorry. Thank
you. In Rutherglen, we've had cross-party support for the food banks, and everybody welcomed them. I would like to get an assurance from the government that after September's vote, we should have social policies in place, that we have a celebration at closing the banks and saving people having the embarrassment of having to be referred to get food for families and nappies. Thank you.
Right, can I answer the question on churches? I'm then going to ask John Swinney to pick up the question on the pound, and then Nicola to answer the question on food banks. I think you've expressed it very well. I mean, we don't envisage any change in the constitutional status of any of Scotland's religions or churches for an independent Scotland. The constitutional status and change that we suggest is that Scotland should have a written constitution. Why should Scotland have a written constitution? Well, every other country in Europe has a written constitution. Every single country in the Commonwealth, with the exception of New Zealand, which has what's called a basic law, which is like a constitution, has a written constitution. It is very, very unusual, in fact, spectacularly unusual for a country not to have a written constitution. And therefore, Scotland should have that. So you say, well, why don't we just produce that now? Well, the reason we don't produce it now is because it would be very difficult for people on the no side of the argument to participate in drawing up a constitution for an independent Scotland. And when you draw up a constitution, it has to be, everybody has to be involved in the process. And there's been some great, spectacular examples of constitutions reinvigorating society. I mean, Iceland, for example, a country on its uppers, went into a constitutional convention, and it was one of the things that brought Icelandic society together with great participation through all the modern media outlets. So we want to have that sort of participation. So we're charging the first Parliament of an independent Scotland to establish a constitutional convention to draw up that written constitution. Does that mean we have no constitution in the meantime? No, because we're putting forward a platform constitution which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights, which gives the protections, the essential protections that we have now in terms of legislation, and which we'll have as we draw up the new constitution for Scotland. But on the position of the churches, of course, the churches, the religions of Scotland would be welcome to participate in that constitutional convention because they are part of the fabric of Scottish society. Of course, their voice will be important and be listened to, but then many voices will be important and listened to. We don't envisage any change in the status of religions of Scotland, but of course the European Convention, one of its key aspects, is that it gives people the freedom and right to practice the religion of their choice and in faith and freedom of conscience. That's one of the parts of the convention. So no particularly privileged position, but a recognition of the importance and influence of our great religious faiths as part of our society. John, do you want to pick up the pound?
First was that
I should rephrase that. Pick up the pound sounds like you're going to... Anyway, the question on the pound.
Well, certainly picking up the pounds is what I often do, First Minister. The question is a very important question, sir. And how I would answer it is to say that the reason why the UK government and UK parties are bluffing just now is that in the aftermath of a referendum, well, we're in a political campaign just now, so it's inevitable they're going to say hostile things. And in the aftermath of the referendum, the dynamics change, and they have to look at what's in their interests as well as in the aftermath of the referendum. And it's in their interests after a referendum for us to maintain the use of the pound. Why is that the case? Well, there's about £60 billion worth of trade goes across the border, north and south, south to north. And what a UK government would have to say to businesses south of the border is, well, we're going to resist Scotland using the pound. We're not going to agree to a currency zone, and therefore we're going to increase your cost of doing business by the order of £500 million to businesses south of the border. And that, to me, is just an unpalatable proposition for a UK government to say to businesses south of the border. The other thing they'll be passing up is the contribution that some of the major industries of Scotland can contribute towards the strength of sterling through the balance of payments, whether that's the international capability of the food and drink sector, particularly around about whisky, or whether it's about the contribution that oil and gas makes to the balance of payments situation. That's a significant factor they would be giving up. But even if those arguments weren't enough to convince you of why the balance of, or the weight of argument is in favour of the position I'm putting forward, if you follow the logic of what the Chancellor said in his speech in Edinburgh a few months ago, he said that Scotland wouldn't be able to have access to sterling because essentially the UK, the rest of the UK, would be the continuing state. And what happens if you're the continuing state is that you take all the debt. So the UK would be absolving Scotland of about something like 120, 130 billion pounds worth of debt. Now, I don't for a moment believe, even in my most optimistic moments, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to turn around and say, OK, you go off and be independent and we'll absolve you of any responsibility for the debt of the United Kingdom. That is just not going to happen. But that's the logical consequence of the position that the Chancellor of the Exchequer takes. So I think it's the reason why they are bluffing is because of two things. One, we're in a political campaign where they're trying to make it sound more difficult than it really is. And secondly, it's in their economic interest for Scotland to be in a sterling zone with the rest of the United Kingdom.
Nicola.
The question about food banks is also very, very important. People who run food banks deserve a lot of gratitude, they deserve our thanks, and there will always be the need in any society to make sure that people who, for whatever reason, find themselves in desperate circumstances get access to support. Now, that support should be through the safety net that the state provides, but there will always be room for voluntary effort in that respect as well. The real problem right now, though, is the one the First Minister alluded to. We've seen and are seeing an explosion in demand for food banks as a direct result of government policies, UK government policies. First Minister mentioned that the Trussell Trust used to have one food bank in the country. It's now more than 40. I think he mentioned 3 within just a few miles of where we're sitting right now. One of those 3 is in my constituency in Govan Hill, just round the corner from my constituency office. It's one of the earlier Trussell Trust food banks, so it's not new. But demand for that one food bank has absolutely gone through the roof in the last couple of years. So much so that for the first time in my 15 years as a member of the Scottish Parliament, I now hold vouchers for it in my constituency office because we've got so many people coming into the office who are in absolutely desperate need. Now, that is just awful in my view. But what makes it more awful is the fact that that is happening because of government policies, and the government implementing those policies know that that is the impact that those policies are having. They know the policies they're implementing are going to put up to 100,000 more children in this country into poverty by 2020, wiping out all of the progress we've made over recent years in reducing child poverty. I think it is unconscionable that a government ploughs ahead implementing policies in the full and certain knowledge that they are plunging so many more people into conditions of dire poverty. So yes is the answer to your question. If we have power over welfare, power over the levers of economic growth, then I want to live in a country that doesn't see so many people dependent on food aid just to feed themselves and their children. We've set out in the white paper some of the policies we would introduce to make sure we do have a decent social security system, one that says that people should work if they can and doesn't give anybody a free ride, but one that also makes sure that there is decent support for people in the most vulnerable of circumstances. And that, in my opinion, is one of the many very good reasons for a yes vote in September, to take the powers of welfare out of the hands of governments that are doing so much damage with those powers and putting them in the hands of Scottish governments that can try to do good with them.
Just to add to what John said, I mean, I absolutely agree with the logic, of the position that John put forward. But I'll tell you what makes my blood boil about this. When George Osborne talks about the pound, you'd think he owns it. You know, you'd think it was his pound. Well, you know, apart from the fact it's an internationally tradable currency, you can't be stopped from using it. Apart from that fact, you know, it was a Scot who founded the Bank of England. You know, it's as much our pound, certainly as George Osborne pound, as anybody else's pound. So the logic that John Swinney puts forward is absolutely impeccable, but it's also just this arrogance of saying, I can dictate to Scots what they can and can't do. If you try to seize the assets, you end up with all the liabilities, and he ends up stuck with that mammoth share of the national debt that he and Alistair Darling had piled up over the last few years. Paul Flynn is an interesting guy, a real honest man, Labour MP, long-standing Labour MP, 30 years or more. A couple of weeks ago, he walked out of a Commons committee because of what he regards as the stitch-up between the Chancellor, the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury and his committee chair on this issue. If you get to this stage that a Labour Member of Parliament an honest man, walks out of a Commons committee deploring this sort of stitch-up, then it shouldn't just make my blood boil. It should raise the hackles of every self-respecting Scot, the language and the dictation of language that's coming from Westminster politicians.
Okay, folk can raise their hands again. We'll take the lady here, and the lady, yep, just there, and then gentleman right at the far end there. Yeah.
There's actually two questions I'd like to ask, if you don't mind. I'd like to know what support you are going to give the Macmillan nurses who help families and people fighting cancer. Also, are we going to still keep help for heroes? That's the two things I'm most concerned with.
Okay.
First Minister, on currency, back to that question, if you do have a plan B or C or D for that matter on currency, will you be honest with us and tell us what those plans are?
Okay, and then
good afternoon. I'm a Highlander, living in the lowlands now, semi-retired. When I was 59, I met you at the Inveralky Games. Highlander, lowland, this is sovereignty, isn't it? Where we're heading. My question, because I'm a retired teacher, I would like to know, because I haven't been able to discover in the white paper, who will administer the present Scottish Public Pensions Agency scheme managed in Galashiels for the future of retired teachers. Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask Alec Neil to address the question on support for nurses? Then Nicola on help for heroes. I'll address the question on currency, and then John on the public pensions. So firstly, Alec, support for nurses, cancer nurses in particular.
Yeah, can I say the Macmillan nurses, first of all, I should say do a fantastic job, and I think everybody in here will agree with that, along with Marie Curie. They're absolutely first class. And more, as more and more people actually survive cancer, the role of specialist nurses like the Macmillan nurses and the Marie Curie nurses is increasingly important. We now actually, for example, have specialist nurses not just in cancer, but in particular types of cancer such as lung cancer. And there is no doubt at all that the health outcomes for people who get that specialist nursing support is dramatically improved vis-a-vis those who don't get it. So we are very, very supportive and work very well both with the Macmillan nurses and with Marie Curie and a range of other organisations. Can I say the survival rate from cancer now is much, much higher than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And we have been running the Detect Cancer Early campaign. You probably saw the first advert was on Detect Cancer Early for breast cancer, and that was fronted by Elaine C. Smith. The second one was for bowel cancer, fronted by Ford Kiernan sitting on the toilet. You'll have seen the advert. And the third one was Sir Alec Ferguson, and that was Detect Cancer Early for lung cancer. So the purpose of these campaigns is to get people to go, whenever they suspect anything wrong, to go to their GP. And the anecdotal evidence we have so far, it's too early to do the full evaluation, is that the increase in the number of people presenting to their GPs, it's 50% increase for breast cancer as a result of Elaine C. Smith's advert, for example. So we are detecting breast cancer, bowel cancer, lung cancer much earlier as a result of that. Because we're detecting it much earlier, and because we therefore have a longer period when we support these patients, then the role of the Macmillan nurses and the Marie Curie nurses in particular is going to expand enormously. Now, as you know, they get a lot of funding from charitable donations and raising their own money. but we also work very closely with them, and obviously we work together in funding a whole range of projects. For example, one of the projects which was very successful was in providing welfare advice to victims of cancer, because very often you have to think about the implications of cancer for the family income. If one partner has to give up their job, sometimes also the other partner gives up their job to look after the partner with cancer. So Macmillan Nurses, I would say, is a jewel in the crown of the wider National Health Service family in Scotland, and we will certainly continue to support them.
Now, we have, I should say, a specific Veterans Minister in the Scottish Government, Keith Brown. Unfortunately, Keith's not here today, but I'm going to ask Nicola to pick up your question on support for Help for Heroes.
The short and simple answer to your question is absolutely yes. We will continue to do whatever we can as a government to support Help for Heroes specifically, but also support other organisations and initiatives that are designed to give support to our veterans. You know, it's not possible to overestimate the importance of giving people who've served their country, often, and particularly in recent years in very difficult and challenging circumstances, the maximum support that we possibly can. As Alex said, we've got a dedicated Veterans Minister, one of my Deputy Ministers, Keith Brown, and Keith has been working very hard to ensure that we are giving our veterans the tailored support they need. So, as everybody will appreciate, if somebody comes out of the armed forces, they will often need access to specialist health support, they will need access to housing, to employment opportunities, and we have a charter approach to veterans to make sure they're getting appropriate access and being supported to get access to all of those services. You know, we simply can, any of us, ever do enough for the men and women who serve in our armed forces, but as a government we are absolutely determined that they get as much support as possible from us.
Now, if I could pick up the question on currency. Just for that, I should just on a personal note say that as part of our programme for commemoration of the Great War, we're having a number of receptions for the veterans' charities, and we had one at Edinburgh Castle a few weeks back for Erskine Home, where my dad resides at the present moment. And so all the nonagenarians from Erskine Home, many of the helpers, the fundraisers from around the country were in the Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle, and it was one of the events, and it was a fantastic reception was had. We did, on an analysis of the quantities of alcohol consumed, discover that it was one of the top receptions, this is the 90-year-olds plus from Erskine, of any reception that had ever been held for drinking whisky per head. So many of our veterans don't just need to be supported, but are still, how shall I put it, enjoying life to the full when they get the opportunity. The lady asked about currency options. We published something called the Fiscal Commission Working Group last year. The Fiscal Commission Working Group is a body of economists who are advising the Scottish Government in these things. And when they published that paper last year, they set out the reason why a sterling zone was in the best interests of Scotland. They also set out a range of other currency options. So not just option B, but option B, C, D, E and F. They set out sterlingisation, they set out a fixed currency, a currency board like Hong Kong has with the dollar at the present moment, a floating currency, an independent Scottish pound. So we didn't just set out a plan B. In that, because they concluded that many of these initiatives or these options would be perfectly viable, we set out plan B, C, D, E and F. But their recommendation and the policy of the Scottish Government, because it's in the best interests of Scotland as well as the rest of the United Kingdom, was to share our currency, share our pound with the rest of the UK. That was the best option for Scotland, as well as being the best option, as they argued, for the rest of the UK. So although we have set out these things, why should we be blown away from the best option just because George Osborne wants to play politics during a referendum campaign? Now, John, the gentleman I met at Inverality some years ago when he was 59, which was just a couple of years ago, wasn't it, sir? The question on the white paper and pensions.
The Scottish Public Pensions Agency is actually an agency that's operationally is a devolved agency, so it's responsible to me as the Finance Minister in Scotland, and there's a board established that I appoint who govern the activities of the Scottish Public Pensions Agency and ensure that it distributes pension resources to principally the Teachers' Pension Scheme and the NHS staff pension scheme within Scotland, although they do a range of other functions into the bargain. So the SPPA is a devolved body, and it would continue to be operate under the responsibility of Scottish ministers. There are obviously issues about pensions policy that they administer, which are taken by the United Kingdom government in terms of the framework of the pension schemes, and obviously that responsibility would come to the Scottish Government after independence. What I suspect lies at the back of your question is your pension safe? And that's really the point that I want to address. And I'd like to express it in this way. A pension is a contractual commitment. When you sign up to be a member of a pension scheme, the public authority or the private funding organisation that gives you that commitment, it signs up to that contractual commitment, and that has to be honoured in all circumstances. And clearly between the Scottish Government and the United Kingdom Government, the payment of pensions are undertaken just now as part of that contractual arrangements, and they would be undertaken by the Government of an Independent Scotland after independence. Now, very recently, one of the UK pensions ministers, Steve Webb, went to the Scottish Affairs Committee in the House of Commons, and he was being encouraged to speculate about what was the future of pensions as a consequence of independence. And Steve Webb expressed the answer in exactly the same way as I've expressed it to you. People have put their money in, they're entitled to get their money out, and that's the absolute guarantee that is given to people as part of the process of independence.
Okay, I'll take a Twitter question this time, but if folk can get their hands up as well. The lady in the middle here and the lady here. Yep. Okay, the Twitter question, and if folk can remember and say their name when they ask the question, the Twitter question is from Sid Patterson, and he asks, in an independent Scotland, what does the SNP plan to do about much of the land being in the hands of the few? That's from Sid Patterson, and the lady in the middle here.
Hello, I've waited 44 years to ask this question, and I'm directing it directly to Mr. Salmon. Are we going to get an independent Scotland? Do we have the wealth to go forward after Margaret Thatcher privatised, nationalised and left us with nothing other than a nuclear waste dump? And has everybody in this room got the faith in SNP to carry it forward? Thank you.
Okay, and the lady here, yeah.
Hi, my name's Marie Christie. I'm part of the Rick West group, but I also go out with SNP, Yes groups, leafleting, just to get the message across. One of the things that's came up is homeless people who think they don't have a right to vote, and they do have a right to vote. So it's a big group out there that, you know, we need to get targeting. The other one is school children. For the first time, 16-year-olds have got a vote. And it seems that in some schools, they're only getting one side of the message. Now, we know what's coming for the mainstream media. So, I mean, I don't have any first-hand knowledge of it, but I'd like to know, how can we get the message, a balanced message, to children who really this decision is going to affect them more than it'll affect any of us? Thank you.
I'm going to ask that Richard Lochhead answers Sid's tweet, okay? And then I'm going to address the lady's question as she asked me to. And then I'm going to ask Mike Russell to answer the question on 16-year-olds at school. So, Richard.
Well, it's good to get a question on land reform in Rutherglen. And that just shows it's not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue as well, land reform. And that is something we've certainly been encouraging over the last few years as an SNP government, to make sure this is seen as a national issue, not just rural but urban as well. And there's a desire amongst the people of Scotland to ensure that our land is owned and managed in the public interest. And we've seen over recent years, especially since the Scottish Parliament was founded in 1999, that more and more communities have expressed desire to control their own destiny by taking over land. And we as a government have been supporting that through the Land Fund and other measures as well. And recently, The First Minister, of course, announced a target of having 1 million acres of Scottish land in community ownership by 2020. So we're halfway there. We've got another 500,000 acres to get into community ownership to achieve that target. Now, recently, of course, we gave a very radical remit to a land reform review group that we set up about a year ago. And we wanted to encourage that review group to bring back some radical measures about what more we could do to ensure that Scotland's land is being used in the public interest and owned in the public interest. So just last week, of course, the review group published their recommendations, and they were very, very ambitious. They are quite radical, and they've captured the public imagination. They've been warmly welcomed around Scotland. So we've now got 62 recommendations presented to the Scottish Government by this review group. We may not agree with all of them, but there's 62 of them, and there are many, many really good ideas in there to encourage a better use of Scotland's land, a fairer use of Scotland's land, fairer ownership of Scotland's land. As the review group said, land should not be something that very rich people want on their Christmas wish list. It's a national interest, it's a national asset. We have to use it for the public and national interest. So we're now going to look at many of these recommendations. We've already said that we'll adopt some of them, such as understanding who owns Scotland's land. It's so complicated. And of course, for centuries, we've been trying to work out who owns Scotland's land, but now we're determined to actually grasp that. And within the next 10 years, we're going to map out exactly who owns Scotland's land. In terms of the independence argument, just to finish off, big agenda for Scotland, clearly, but it's also very relevant to Scotland's land as well. And the review group, of course, as many other people have done, including this government, have called for the Crown Estate to be devolved to Scotland where it belongs. It's not right that archaic institution run and manage Scotland's seabeds, our near shores, and some of our harbours and assets. These assets should be determined on behalf of Scotland by the Scottish Parliament and people in our local communities. So we certainly want to get the Crown Estate into Scotland's hands, as the review group mentioned. Also, tax and fiscal measures which can influence how land is owned are also reserved to Westminster. So the sooner we've got control of that as well, the more we can look at the bigger picture in terms of how to manage land. So land reform is now central to Scotland's agenda, central to the SNP government's agenda, but also very much central to the independence agenda as well.
I'm real glad that you asked the question, because one of the things I was trying to do in my speech was address the point of reindustrialisation and how it's really important to regard an economy as an area where you make things, not just sell services, but make things. Well, I'm going to come at that just in a second. And you're quite true what you said about the deindustrialisation that took place in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, but also the deindustrialisation that's gone on since. And as we try to restore that position, it's quite true that the industries which were lost in the 1980s are not necessarily going to be industries you can bring back. You can't, I suspect, go back to a situation where 150,000 people in Scotland were employed underground digging coal. I don't think that will ever happen again. And many of the new industries that we move into are not the industries of the heavy industrial period. But don't underrate the wealth and resource of this country. We have 60% of the oil reserves, not of the UK, but of Europe. We have 25% of the renewable resource offshore, of wave, of wind, of tidal power, again, of the whole continent of Europe. We have 20% of the fish stocks of the continent of Europe, not of the UK, and we're 1% of Europe's population. So this country, with 1% of the population, has 60% of the oil, 25% of the renewables, and 20% of the fish stocks. Now, most countries, every country, I think, would give their eye teeth for that sort of resource and asset reserve. So then you come to a question, are our people, are they ingenious or inventive or hard-working enough to take advantage of these natural resources? I think we are. I just came back from America for Tartan Week, and there's a guy was making a speech, and he was citing a book written by an American historian, which is entitled How Scotland Invented the Modern World. Now, it's quite useful that it was an American historian. If we'd written that book, you know, it'd been a kind of was like us. But this was an American historian who's written a book, How Scotland Invented the Modern World, and has gone through every great invention which has dictated the modern era: television, telephone, penicillin, and every single one of them was invented by Scots. And I suppose, you know, when I was a lad at school in Lithgow, I used to think about that because I thought, you know, all these inventions seem to be folk from Scotland, you know, whether it be the steam engine or whatever. You know, why did we invent all these things? And the reason, of course, is not just that we were inventive. It was we had the first universal education in the world. So because Scotland was the first country in the world, along with probably Prussia and Sweden, who said it was a great idea to educate the people, not just some of the people, we had far, far more people who were able to invent things. And if you look at the great inventors who did all these inventions, they all came, by and large, from humble origins. And if they'd been born in any other country, they wouldn't have had the opportunity because they wouldn't have had the education to enable them to go on to make the great advances in science or medicine or whatever. Now, I think we've still got that ingenuity. And one of the reasons that we restored free education in this country was to make sure that every young Scot had the ability to go to higher education at college or university if they had the ability to do so. That's what we are pledged to do. We've got a record number of Scots in higher education, full-time higher education, at the present moment in Scotland. So if we've got folk with the ability, and we have, and we've got that track record of ingenuity, and we've got the resource base, well, that's the point I was coming to. Aye, that's exactly the point I was coming to. Not just your daughter, but 38,700 people between the ages of 16 to 34 every year have left Scotland in outward migration. 38,700 every year in the last 10 years. Now, you know, we've heard a lot about immigration in the last few weeks, taking the debate in the United Kingdom. I believe that Scotland's biggest challenge is not immigration, but emigration. That's the young Scots who've had to go elsewhere to find opportunity. Now, either we can say this country, with its huge natural resources, with its enormously talented people, ain't capable of doing what every other country with that combination has and becoming one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Either we say that, or we say perhaps there's something wrong with the economic management which has resulted in a position where people like your daughter and these other 38,000 people can't get a decent opportunity in their own country in terms of how the economic management is deployed. Now, I think that is an argument why we should take these decisions into our hands in Scotland to create that future for our people and to make sure we can create that prosperous and equal society. And Mr. Russell.
Thank you.
Lady, yes.
Can I just say that when we've had the opportunity to give votes to 16 and to 17-year-olds, that's what we've done. Although the referendum is the biggest example, when we had the Health Board elections, when we had the Crofting Commission legislation, anything we could do, we expanded the franchise because that's the right thing to do. But we've got to make sure in the referendum the information that young people is given is impartial and fair. So at a very early stage, I gave the responsibility to Education Scotland, working with the Electoral Commission, to provide impartial, fair information to every school in Scotland. So that's the first thing that we did, and every young person who's going to vote should have access to that information. It was also very important that we relied on the professionalism of teachers. That's what Curriculum for Excellence does. It says to teachers, we've trained you, you're good teachers, therefore we trust you to teach well. And we rely on the professionalism of teachers to be impartial in this matter, to make sure that young people understand the choices that they have and can make their own minds up. And of course, if there were any evidence that that wasn't happening, then the professional bodies would act accordingly, because that would show that the teachers were not acting professionally. Now, I haven't seen any evidence of that, but if that was what was happening, then those teachers would be in dereliction of their duty and would be working against, for example, the conditions of their registration. But, of course, there will also be the exposure of young people to the full debate, and that's where the yes and the no campaign comes in, because many schools will be organising debates. I've taken part in several of them myself, and that gives the young people a chance not just to listen, but usually in those debates to take part quite actively. I did a fascinating one in Campbellton not so long ago, where there was a student who was on the yes side and a student on the no side, and they were arguing with the support of myself as the MSP on one side and the MP on the other side. And that's the type of thing that needs to take place. Now, I think we're seeing young people are a tough audience. They need to be convinced. They're thinking about it. They're hearing about this at home. They're hearing about it in the media. But I find when they're exposed to the debate, to the choice, then they look at the positives more strongly than the negatives. And when you think about it, this is a remarkable opportunity for young people. When I go to a school like that, I'm always pretty overwhelmed by the thought that voting yes for those young people means that they will focus their lives on something that John Adams, the second American president, said about American independence. Focus their lives on a task of building government anew from the foundations. So they will have the chance to make a country, a new country, the country that they want to see, and to shape that themselves. And I think that's the most incredible opportunity. And if you put that to young people, they tend to react to that with huge enthusiasm, as they should.
Okay, I'll slot in another Twitter question, this time from Linda, who asks, what will an independent Scotland do to change the lives of young disabled people? And you have hands. Gentleman right at the back there with the white paper. And the lady, no, the gentleman there, sorry. Yeah. I couldn't see whose arm it was.
Hello, good afternoon, guys. My name is Mark, and I'm affiliated to a small group called Opticians for Yes. But my question's actually about Trident. I'm sure you'll remember that there was an unnamed UK government source in The Guardian a few weeks ago who seemed to suggest that despite the UK government's bluffing, that a currency union might be on the table, with the caveat that Trident stays in the Clyde. Now, I know that there's a very strong commitment from the government for removal of Trident. Is that non-negotiable? And how does that square with the don't ask, don't tell policy for our NATO partners?
My wife has worked for over 40 years in Scotland, and she had a contract with the government that said in exchange for paying pension contributions, she would receive a pension and be able to retire at the age of 60. Within 15 months of obtaining that age, she was told, sorry about that, you're now going to have to work until you're 65 and 10 months. What would an independent Scotland government do to address that breach of contract?
The question of young people with disabilities, Shona as our Equalities Secretary, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, certainly. Maybe just to say a word about what we're doing in the here and now in the Scottish Government with our partners to support young people with disabilities. I think it's very important that we get education right for young people with disabilities and that they get the same opportunities in education as anyone else. Now, the preference for that is for young disabled people to access mainstream education with appropriate support, but where that's not possible, good specialist education. So it's important young disabled people get the right start in life, and schools are very important for that. When they move into education and training in the workplace beyond school, it's very important that we support them also. And just to say a word about a couple of things that we're doing in that respect, we have made the employment recruitment incentive, which is available to employers, particularly focused on taking more young people with disabilities into the workplace, because we know that young people with disabilities find it harder to get a job, and there's a whole range of reasons for that. Some perceptions by employers, maybe a lack of confidence by the young person themselves. So we've got a lot of programs in place through things like the employment recruitment incentive, modern apprenticeships, graduate schemes, to really help young people with disabilities get into the workplace and into training opportunities. If I can just say in terms of independence, there are some very, very important things that would change with independence. The first is, we heard earlier on about the written constitution. Well, the written constitution would include a right to education, work and training. And that's very important for young disabled people because it will enshrine rights for them to have the same opportunities in life as anyone else. And finally, I think in terms of the type of Scotland that we'll see, we heard earlier on about a fairer, more prosperous Scotland. Without a doubt, some of the welfare reforms that are emanating from the UK government are very harmful to young people with disabilities. They remove some of the very important supports that they had to be able to maintain themselves living independently. And most young people, whether they're disabled or not, want to live independently in their own home with support. And the welfare reforms that we're seeing from the UK government are fundamentally undermining that independence. And with independence, and a vote for independence on the 18th of September, we can help to restore that independence for young disabled people by having a fairer welfare system that encourages people and supports young people to work, but also provides that safety net where young people with disabilities are not able to work. And that's one of the really important messages, I think, to get across. We want a fairer Scotland, and with independence we can create that.
I'm going to ask Angela, who's the Secretary for Youth Employment, to just say a word about the employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And then I'm going to ask John to address the gentleman's question directly on pensions, and then I'll address the one on Trident.
Thank you. I'm always very struck by the fact that the employment rate of people with disabilities, particularly young people, is far, far lower than their contemporaries. The same can also be said of young people who have a care background. So we know that there are some groups of young people that are faring far less well than their peer group. And that has to be, you know, a big wake-up call for us, because we know, given any economic downturn, that it's always young people per se that are hit the hardest, and that's even more the case with young people with disabilities or young people who have other forms of disadvantage. Now, Shona outlined many of the schemes that we fund within the Scottish Government. We have Community Jobs Scotland, which we have ensured that there's a proportion of those places that are ring-fenced for young people with disabilities and particular backgrounds. We've got an employment recruitment incentive, as mentioned by Shona, and we've also got a graduate internship scheme, which might be of interest to the lady who asked the question earlier about graduates, because we know that graduates from a black minority ethnic background or young graduates with a disability, again, have a lower employment record. And that's, you know, it's statistics like that that we very much want to turn around. And I suppose I'll say two further things about that. In Scotland, we already have some independence, so we've got control over our education system, our skills and our training system. But what we don't have control over as yet is our economy and all those levers of economic power that every other country in Europe has. But nonetheless, we are absolutely doing everything we can just now to turn the lives around for our young people. And I'll just flag up one other very important piece of work that we're embarking upon. Next week, the Wood Commission will produce its final report. That's the Commission for Developing Scotland's Young Workforce. And that's very much learning from the best performing economies in Europe. And what I know about the best performing economies in Europe is that they all have very low levels of youth unemployment, less than 10%, and that's despite a big global economic challenge, that there is half a dozen countries in Europe with very low levels of youth unemployment, and that's the countries that we want to emulate. It's also these countries that have very well established vocational education and training, and that is something that we have to further develop in Scotland. We've had huge programmes of reform in terms of curriculum for excellence, colleges, career guidance, but we now need to take all of that good work to the next level to ensure that we are amongst one of the best European countries in terms of what we deliver for our young people, and aspire to and use the means that we have to get amongst the lowest levels of youth unemployment anywhere in Europe. And the Wood report is very pivotal in terms of the structures that we need to put in place to deliver world-class vocational education and training that matches our world-class higher education as well. But it will also include some very important recommendations about how we improve the life chances of young disabled people, as well as some other groups of young people that are quite excluded.
Fine. Thank you, Angela. John, the gentleman's question on pension, his wife's pension.
Yeah. I think the best way I can answer that is to say that obviously when Scotland becomes independent, we will inherit a pension structure from the United Kingdom with a set of rules that will be that will apply at that time. And what we've said is that one of the areas that we will look at again is the proposed changes to the retirement age, to look again at the proposal to increase the retirement age from 66 to 67, and we'll consider that as part of the work that we undertake as a government in the aftermath of independence. There will, of course, have been changes that have been made to particularly women's pensions, which will be part of the existing arrangements that we inherit at the time of independence, which it will be difficult for us to unravel, given the fact that they are part of the arrangements that have been put in place by the reforms that have been undertaken. But certainly in terms of the issues around retirement age in the future, particularly driven by the fact that life expectancy in Scotland is shorter than in the rest of the United Kingdom, which obviously curtails the amount to which people are able to enjoy their retirement. We will look again at those issues as part of the work that we undertake after independence.
Okay. And finally, if I could turn to the gentleman's question. You're quite right to point to the Guardian newspaper report of a few weeks ago, which incidentally the unnamed government minister, senior government ministers, and I don't think the Guardian made it up, said, quote, "Of course there'll be a currency union." And then suggested, as the gentleman's question indicated, of course, one of the things that could be negotiated was Trident, was the location of Trident missiles. Now, for us, for the SNP, and I hope for Scotland, Trident isn't a negotiable item. It's one of the reasons for becoming independent, that we can choose not to have Europe's largest concentration of weapons of mass destruction a few miles from our major population centre. It's one of the reasons why we should make our own choices as a country and society. Now, in the white paper, we say that it's not a question of saying out tomorrow, because that's not a reasonable thing to do, and you have to do things safely and properly. So we give the timescale of the first term, the first parliamentary term of an independent Scottish government, which is 5 years, and that's a perfectly reasonable time to effect the removal of these nuclear weapons. Now, there is two reasons for that. One is the moral case against nuclear weapons, which we are strongly in support of the moral case against nuclear weapons. But there's a second and very practical reason, is that the UK government is already spending on our behalf, and it's our money, substantial sums on the replacement of Trident missiles. And if that nuclear system is replaced, then it's going to be with us in Scotland for the next 50 to 60 years. That will be the term of the replacement for Trident. And over that period of time, the estimated expenditure is £100,000 million. That's £100 billion, which is an extraordinary sum of money. To put it into context, it's about a third of the entire revenues from the North Sea over the last 40 years. So it's a very, very large sum indeed. Now, I can think of 100 things that I would like to do with Scotland's share of that expenditure, and none of them involve building up massive systems of weapons of mass destruction. So for both the moral case and the economic case, that we should go forward with a position that we shall ask, politely but firmly, that there won't be nuclear weapons hosted in Scotland after this country becomes independent.
Time is against us, so we'll take one last round of 3 questions. There's always more hands come up at that point. Before we have, so the gentleman right at the end of the white T-shirt, the lady in blue here, yes, with the blue jacket, and the lady at the back here, yeah.
Thanks. My name's Bobby Mitchell from Castlemilk Community Council. I'd just like to ask, Scotland needs more social rented houses. Does the Scottish Government get any provisions in place for this? And also, the biggest challenge we face in housing is the Scottish Housing Regulator. I'd just like to know who regulates the regulator.
Okay, lady here now.
Good afternoon, my name's Claire McCall. This is a question for the Justice Minister. I'm very, very concerned about the amount of drugs that's available in the Cambuslang and Rutherglen area. Last week I was with friends down in Ayrshire, and I believe there was a large tanker off the coastline with a massive amount of drugs which were detected on board. and the drug traffickers were sitting in a very beautiful hotel on the Ayrshire coastline. In a free Scotland, what would you do differently to address this problem and keep our children safe? Thank you.
Elizabeth Allen. Any negotiations that happen in the event of independence, you will obviously be negotiating for Scotland. Whoever is negotiating for the rest of the UK will be doing so for the benefit of the rest of the UK. Why should the Bank of England be prepared to act as a bank of last resort to a foreign country? Why should the rest of the UK be prepared to allow that? And why do the Scottish Government not expect that Scotland, unlike most other countries who have become independent in the last 100 years, should not have their own independent currency and their own central bank and stand on their own 2 feet? To do otherwise is not independence.
Right. Can I suggest, Kenny, you address Claire's point first on drugs? I'm going to ask Nicola then to address the point on social housing, and particularly the Castle Milk question of who regulates the regulator. I absolutely love that. And then I'll address the currency question and the Bank of England. So, Kenny, you first.
You're right. Drugs scar communities. It's not just the individuals who suffer harm, it's their families, it's those who suffer from the criminality that often goes with it. Improvements are happening. There is progress being made. Yet less young people are being drawn into it, but still far too many are. It is a global issue. I was briefed by the National Crime Agency about the incident off the Ayrshire coast. That's where both law enforcement, north and south of the border, and indeed with Europol, and I think a lot of these drugs emanated actually from a different continent and it wasn't, European. So we'll continue to cooperate there. I think what we'll see different under an independent Scotland is building upon the good work we've done where we're world leading in many ways. First of all, tackling the supply and the criminality. We have a serious organised crime task force that addresses the criminality that goes with it, that deals with it not just in terms of enforcement and dealing with street traders, but also, as we've seen, I'll come on to, deals with taking and stripping the assets from those involved. Because a lot of the people that harm the communities are low level. The people who are making most money out of it are at a very high level and are not in those communities. And we've got to make sure that the real villains, they're all involved in criminality, but the ones who are making the most money out of it are dealt with. And that's why we've opened up the Gartcosh Crime Campus to bring everybody together. And finally, it is also, it's not just about tackling supply. It's also about demand. It's about dealing with young people who have a feeling of hopelessness, of despair, no stake in society, which is why it was a great pleasure that the cashback scheme that the First Minister mentioned is about putting back into youngsters, those who have fallen from the wayside, and trying to get them back on the straight and narrow and putting more investment in so that kids don't get involved in the lifestyle and indeed the criminality that goes with it, because sometimes we've got to ensure that we tackle demand as well as address the issues that go with supply.
Nicola, the Castle Milk question.
Yes, it's quite a timely question in terms of the first part on supply of social rented affordable housing, because we've got new housing figures just out today. They're figures that are published quarterly showing how many houses are being built in Scotland, and obviously the housing market, both in terms of the private market and the social rented market, has been through some very challenging times in the last few years, but the figures published today have got a lot of very encouraging signs within them. And one of the things they tell us is that we are, as a government, more than on track to meet our commitment of delivering 30,000 new affordable homes over the lifetime of this Parliament. We're at about 19,000, just over that just now, well on track to meeting that target. So we need to keep really focused on that, but we're investing heavily, as you will know, in trying to increase the supply of social rented housing. We're doing other things like taking away the right to buy, which has had its day, but the time now, given the demands for social rented housing, is to preserve the stock for those who need it to be available to rent, and we're doing a range of things to try to make sure that we've got a good supply of housing for this and for future generations. Your question about the regulator, again, not surprised to hear you ask that question. I'll say one or two things first before directly answering your question, who regulates the regulator. It's really important, and I'm pretty sure you'll agree with this, that there is robust regulation in this area. organisations that have the responsibility of delivering social housing, people's homes, you know, have got a big responsibility, and it's right that they are properly regulated. You know, obviously if something goes wrong in these organisations, it affects people's lives very, very directly. It's also right that the regulator is independent of government. It wouldn't be right for the government to dictate to the regulator what to do, and that's the regime we've got in Scotland. That said, you know, I've got very active housing associations in my own constituency. I hear some of the concerns and some of the issues that I'm sure are behind your question. The direct answer to your question is the regulator is accountable ultimately to Parliament. It's Parliament that legislates and has legislated to put in place the current regulatory regime that we've got. Parliament can decide at any time it deems it appropriate to change that regulatory framework if it thought there was a case for doing so. The regulator herself, as you're probably aware, appears before the relevant parliamentary committee once a year, so is there to be questioned on the various matters that she is responsible for. But ultimately, it would be down to Parliament to decide whether changes either to the overall regulatory system or to particular aspects of it were appropriate. I'm happy to have a wee chat with you afterwards about that. As I say, I have some of the very active housing associations in the West Scotland Forum in my constituency, so I regularly hear these arguments and engage in discussion about them, so I'm happy to have a wee chat with you afterwards if you want.
Now, can I address the lady's point about the Bank of England and lender of the last resort? Firstly, in terms of what happens after the referendum, we set up something called the Edinburgh Agreement, which is the document which enabled the referendum which is taking place on the 18th September to be done in a way which was beyond legal challenge. And the Edinburgh Agreement specifies a whole range of things. But one of the crucial clauses is clause 30, which says that both governments will accept the result, whatever it is, and then both governments will act in the best interests of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So that clause 30 is there for a specific purpose, to say that, you know, whatever is said during the campaign period when people are trying to intimidate or scare people out of this, that and the next thing, that Edinburgh Agreement was there and framed in that way to remember that once the campaign is over, the day after the referendum, people have to sit down and discuss things, regardless of the result, in the best interests of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Why would the Bank of England want to be a lender of last resort? Well, they make money out of being lender of last resort. Providing liquidity to banks is what the Fed did for Barclays during the financial crisis. It's something that central banks make money out of, never mind anything else. But why would you have a currency union? You say that all countries have their own currency. Lots and lots of countries have been in currency unions. Belgium and Luxembourg, for example, had one for 80 years. 80 years Belgium and Luxembourg had a currency union. It was called Benelux. Yeah, well, it was a framework and currency union whereby Luxembourg had a monetary institute and was represented in terms of the structures of the Belgian Central Bank, and it worked highly successfully for 80 years in the 20th century. But many, many other countries have been in currency unions. Does or doesn't that make them independent? I think you can be independent within a currency union. The reason for keeping the pound is the reasons that John explained earlier, the reasons that are outlined in the Fiscal Commission's report of last year. But the reasons that you're still independent is control over fiscal policy, control over taxation and spending. Currently, the Scottish Parliament controls 12% of Scotland's revenue base. 88% is controlled by Westminster. That figure is moving up to 18% in some of the changes that are taking place, leaving 82% controlled by Westminster. We control 60% of the spending decisions. The other 40% over social security and pensions and a variety of other things that have been mentioned are controlled by Westminster. I think we're independent when we control 100% of our taxation base and 100% of our spending decisions. That's what makes us independent. And of all of the choices that we've been talking about today, the whole range of things that have been asked about pensions, about social security, about aspects of land reform which depend on control of taxation, all of these things are things that we cannot do now, which we shall be able to do when we're independent. Which is why I've tried to put across this case, not to say, look, Scotland is going to be a land of milk and honey from day one of independence. You know, we're not going to wake up on the 19th September and have free taps, whiskey, oil and water. That is not going to happen. But nonetheless, over a period of time, with control of the taxation base of this country, given our massive natural resources, the natural ingenuity of our people, we have what it takes to create not just a more prosperous but a more equal society. And my goodness, given what we've got just now, that must be worth voting for on the 18th September.
Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That's been a very interesting and diverse range of subjects that you have raised. Now, if I can remind folk that the discussions do continue over in the lesser hall, so for folk who've got comments they want to make or to continue discussions and asking questions of Cabinet Ministers, there's the opportunity to have those discussions over a cup of tea in the lesser hall. But for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, can I say thank you very much on behalf of the First Minister and the Cabinet. Thank you.